Good morning, everyone. I'm Laura Cunningham here for another week of Ask the Agronomist with Phil Long. So, Phil, one of the topics of interest this week is planting soybeans into dry soil. And so, a good leadoff question maybe is how deep should we be planting our soybeans?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a perfect time to talk about it. It seems like we've been struggling to get moisture, at least in Iowa and a good chunk of Latham country, which is great. It's really helped progress planting progress. I know farmers are happy to see things get in the ground, and honestly, soil conditions have been really good. I mean, even a lot of corn was planted into really good, nice, mellow soil. It just seems like things worked out a lot like last year in most cases, worked down really well, and now a lot of farmers are, well, some may be finishing up soybeans, but a lot of them have gotten last week to soybeans, and they're sitting there checking their planting depth thinking, 1 inch, 1.5 inches, what we recommend for soybeans typically is not going to be in moisture. So that does kind of create a problem. And then you start asking the question, I've probably gotten it 4 or 5 times just in the last couple of days. How deep can we push soybeans? Should we plant them as deep as corn? Should we plant to the moisture? That kind of thing. So it's a great question. And to me, my cutoff is typically around 2 inches. So soybeans can emerge from 2.5, even 3 inches. They will emerge, but once you get down to 2.5, 3 inches, they really start to struggle, and they'll start to really emerge unevenly. Once you get it past that 2.5 inch mark, one thing you can think about, one thing I like to think about when you're talking about soybeans, those first leaves that come out of the ground, those are the cotyledons. So if you think about it, that is your energy reserve. Those are the 2 halves of the soybean seed. That's that come up and open, and the first thing really to start photosynthesizing. But that's what holds all of those energy reserves to get out of the ground. So it's kind of, like us, when we have so many hours we can make it on one meal, and then we start to get hungry. The soybeans down in the ground, the bigger seed they have, potentially the more reserves that they have to push out of the ground. So technically, a bigger seed may be able to be planted a little deeper. That's typically how it works. However, the other thing you got to think about when you're thinking about, bigger seed, it can handle being planted deeper. It also has to pull bigger cotyledons or seed leaves up through the ground. So it requires more energy, but also requires a lot more to break through that crust if there is one. So the 2 things I keep in mind is we got really good conditions as far as soil temperatures right now. We're sitting in a lot of cases close to 70, even in the mid 50s in most of our territory. Really good soil, warm soil conditions that will germinate quickly and get into that process. They'll be up and out of the ground in a week or so. So that's a good thing. But the moisture part is a little bit of a struggle when we're seeing moisture levels down at the 2 inch or so mark when we're trying to work ground. So yeah, it's a good point of discussion, and my thoughts are around that 2 inch mark. I start to, maybe it's best to put them in the ground, get them in there, and wait for rain.
Okay, so soybeans in dry soil, maybe we're pushing the depth just a little bit. What are some hazards that we should be watching for then?
Yeah, so the first one I would say is that crusting. This is something that seems like soybeans get to deal with on a regular basis, and I've seen about every year for a while now. And not trying to lay blame on any one thing. A lot of times crusting just, maybe we worked the soil too much. Like I said, conditions were really good this year, and it just seems like it worked up well with a lot less clods. So it's fine, soil. And when we get that hard rain, depending how your planter's set up and stuff, we can have crusting within the row and so forth, which makes it more of a challenge. 30-inch rows are better for that because they have more pressure. The soybeans are closer together, so they can push out harder. If you've ever seen soybeans break through a crust, a lot of times it'll break in a line. And the more they are closer together, the better off they are to emerge and not break off. But if you're in 15s or so forth, a drill and so forth, they're not going to have as much power together to push through a crust. And the other thing is rolling. A lot of land rolling and so forth being done sometimes can make it a real struggle for soybeans to get out of the ground. It essentially kind of pulverizes that top after we do a nice finishing work, and then we go over it with a roller. It can really kind of pulverize that top layer of soil, and then all we need is a little rain and heat, and we've got a really, that fine soil, it's kind of crushed up, the aggregate structure is gone, and can really cement those together in the top, which makes it really tough. And in a lot of cases, you can go out there, if you dig up soybeans, and we'll post a picture too, but you can look at that hypocotyl, that part that pulls those cotyledons, they call it the hypocotyl arch or hook, pulls those cotyledons out of the ground, will be really swollen. It'll look really big, and that's because it's been trying to get out of the ground for an extended period of time, and after so much effort, will eventually snap off. So that's one potential thing to keep in mind. The other one that I would mention is herbicides. So this is an interesting one. I've had a lot of discussions here this spring on this because of the dry conditions. So the good thing is it's dry. Typically, we don't have to worry about herbicide damage, at least on soybeans we see in the PPO inhibitors and so forth, like Authority, the sulfentrazone products. That's not as much of an issue in a dry year like this, and it's warm. Like I said, soil temps are warm, so they're growing quicker, which is good. The opposite, the bad side of that, I guess you could call it, is that the herbicides aren't working. Working them in and so forth can help, but if we haven't had that half-inch or so of rain that really helps get those herbicides in solution, then they're not going to be available for the weed seedlings to take up and ultimately kill off those seedlings. So that's the bad side of that. The good side is we're probably not going to have to worry about that as much as we typically see in a year in seeding soybeans. So that's a good thing. The one other thing I'd say is that I'd like to remind everybody that soybeans do require 50% of their weight in water to absorb that to start the germination process. Corn is 30%, so it takes quite a bit of moisture, but soybeans do it really quickly. So anything that competes for moisture with a soybean is going to be kind of the arch nemesis of the soybean plant. So what I mean by that is if there's high salt fertilizers out there, potassium chloride or potash, if we have things like that out there in the soil, obviously not a good thing. If you have high rates of it, could potentially cause issues in a dry year like this, because they're going to be pulling moisture. The soybeans are trying to pull moisture, but they're going to pull harder and actually steal moisture out of the soybean and cause major issues with that and kill off cells. So.
Okay. So the third question then. A phrase we often hear on the corn side during planting season is plant to the moisture. So is that something we should be doing on the soybean side? Yes or no? What do you think?
Yeah, it's actually a pretty good, in my opinion, fairly good idea. You want to plant typically in about, a half-inch or so of moisture is a good rule of thumb. But when we see moisture levels, depending on your soil texture, if they're down at 3 inches, then you probably don't want to plant to the moisture. At 3 and 3.5 inches, soybeans are really going to struggle to get out of the ground evenly, and then you're going to have to make a call that you probably don't want to in some cases. So I would say, remember that 2-inch mark. Start planting, checking. Obviously, if you're in a field situation where it's drier, I've seen a lot of no-till fields this year. Was a good thing this year. A lot more moisture in those fields. So this is the year where those that do cover crops and no-till could really have a good discussion with other folks. There's just a lot more moisture being held in there. It wasn't released. And like we mentioned earlier, a few Ask the Agronomist back about tillage, the moisture loss. Just a lot of those factors come into play. But I would be cautious about seeding much over 2 inches in depth. And the other thing I'd add to that is to remember as they're coming out of the ground. So we always like to see the soybeans and the corn, so we can row it and breaking through the ground. Once again, get out there and look at them. Make sure that you're taking note of where they're at and take those stand counts. It doesn't take that long. I use the shorthand version. If you're familiar with that, an acre, or excuse me, 1/1000th of an acre is 17.5 feet roughly. But if you want to do a shorter version like I do, it's about 21 inches. So 21 inch, everybody should be carrying a tape measure in their truck anyway. 21 inches of row on a 30-inch soybean row. Obviously, you should take more than one count in 21 inches, but that gives you a quick idea. Is there 14 plants there? Okay, it's 140,000. You multiply it by 10,000. So just a good rule of thumb. If you see them coming up really delayed emergence, the one thing I would say is if you have plants that are already getting close to putting a trifoliate leaf out, V1 essentially on soybean plant, it's not going to be worthwhile to replant or to put them in next to it, things like that. Sometimes farmers try that. So just remember, if it's early stages, just breaking through the ground and it's really uneven, you can dig a few more up and see that they're not coming. You can still have time to make a decision, but in most cases, once you get one trifoliate leaf out, those plants, if you would replant, even though they'll come up really quickly, will not contribute to yield. So a lot of factors here, but not trying to, just want to give everybody some things to think about when they're thinking about pushing planting depth. It might be better to, to keep it around that 2-inch mark or less. And let's, hope and pray for a little rain too. So.
All right, great. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our viewers with as we wrap up this week?
No, I think the scouting to me would be the biggest key takeaway right now, knowing what you have out in your field and taking note of that. Soybeans, I like soybeans, obviously, and they have an amazing ability to flex and adapt. So don't get too excited early on, but also remember, like I said, that they do have limitations. So 3.5 inches is too much for a soybean.
Okay. Well, thanks, Phil. Great topic today. Good guidelines as we watch a lot of these crops start to emerge across our upper Midwest territory. Viewers, thanks for tuning in this week. If you have any other questions, feel free to submit them via social media. We watch that weekly and would love to address those topics on a future episode. So have a great week. Wishing you all that are still working on planting activity a smooth week. And we'll tune in next week with another topic.